Hello, my name's Annette with Sunbeam Fabric Art. Welcome to my channel. In a recent video, I sorted all my scraps out by color. Now this is different from the way I've done it in the past. In the past, 2024 and 2023, I just sewed all my scraps together regardless of color and made giant fabric bolts. The first video I made with these scraps was the neutrals, beiges, whites, blacks. The second color I tackled was green. On my left here you'll see this log cabin block quilt that I made, and it's got alternating wide and narrow strips. I love it, I love it, love it. But there were leftovers from this quilt, and I turned this leftover batch into this quilt over here. And I still have lots and lots of green scraps to work with, probably enough for 2 to 3 more projects. I see lots of comments on my videos with scraps, and I totally agree. Somehow scraps just multiply in the night, and when we're not looking, it's something magical that happens. But let's get started, and I'll show you how I made this quilt on my right. Here's a look at the pile of leftovers from the first quilt that I'm looking at. It doesn't seem like a lot, but it's amazing how much this will make. My first step was to sort out these strips, which were 1.5 inches wide and 2.5 inches wide by length. I had some strips that were with the fabric. Those I decided to go ahead and cut in half to make everything more manageable. Then I simply started sewing strips together of equal lengths. I also tried as much as I could to alternate wide and narrow strips and light and darker green strips. I always start with the longest strips first, because if they don't match, I can take the smaller part that remains and put it in one of the piles of smaller strips. I just kept working my way by order of length, and over to the left the strips are getting shorter and shorter, and I'm working my way through all of those. Once I got through round 1, I separated this entire chain. Then it was time for round 2, where I am joining 2 strips to 2 other strips. So now my units are 4 strips wide. I repeated this process over and over until all my strips were joined together in one long piece. Having done this chain piecing process many times, I can tell you that round 1 is the most painful. It takes the longest, but each subsequent round takes half as long as the previous round. When I got to the last round, this is where you'll see I am just sewing pieces together, and then I'm adding a piece to that piece. I didn't create a chain when they got this big. I just started sewing all these pieces together, and at the end of this last round, I've got my one long strip. I did keep the smaller strip set separate. This is the one that's about maybe 3 to 4 inches or less. I kept that as one separate strip apart from the large strips. Next, it was time to iron all these strip sets. You just see I am pressing them all the same direction. It's not going to matter because by this time I had determined what I was going to do, and I knew that I wasn't going to have to match up any of these seams. It's times like these when I wish I had a giant sewing studio, but honestly, downsizing was the right way to go for us, so I make do with the small space that I have. I evaluated what I had for my strips, and I cut some of them into very, very skinny strips. Some of them I cut into about 2.5-inch strips, and I'm finding the narrowest strip so I can match that up so I get nice straight cuts. I'm going to cut down one side first, and once I have that one side with a nice straight edge, I will flip these units around and decide how wide I am going to be cutting these strips. To start, I cut these nice wide strip sets into 6-inch widths. I had one strip set that I cut into 4.5 inches, some that I cut into 3 inches, and some even smaller. Well, I thought about what to do, and I decided to add one 5-inch square from my stash in a green, and then I added 2.5-inch white strips. I'm going to start by adding 2.5-inch strips to the outside of my 5-inch square. Then I'm going to start adding layers of scraps to keep making my square larger and larger. Once I had the center of my planned quilt completed, then it was time to just start adding my scrap strips around all 4 sides. I did not pre-cut any of the lengths of these scrap strips. I just sewed and then clipped to each size as I needed it. With the first side done, I trimmed and I just finger pressed this back. And just going around this square in a clockwise fashion, I'm adding one side at a time in this small strip. Once I had that finished, I added another border layer of white 2.5-inch strips all the way around the square. After that, I added a layer border of the 6-inch strip sets. Next, I added another layer of my white 2.5-inch strip all the way around the square. Next was another border round of the skinnier strip set all the way around the square. Then another layer of white 2.5-inch strips all the way around the square. And the very last thing I added was one last layer of 6-inch strip all the way around the square. Once that was done, I trimmed up all 4 corners of this quilt. Off to the left, you can see the tiny pile of scrap strips I have left. I've got to find something to do with those now. Here is a look at that finished quilt. I really don't know what to call it, but the colors are the same as the log cabin quilt that I showed you at the beginning. And I just love the way these greens and beiges go together. It's just beautiful, and I can't wait to make 2 or 3 more projects from these scraps. If you've got a suggestion for these green and beige scraps for another project, I'd be glad to have you mention it in the comments, and I'll see what I can do. Thank you again so much for joining me today. I truly appreciate it, and I hope to see you back again real soon.